This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, we now bring you a discussion on spectrum auction. The participants are Mahesh Uppal, telecom expert, and Ruchika Chitravanshi, journalist.
The 4G telecom spectrum auction for 2021 ended yesterday on March 2nd, and the government has received bids worth 77,000 crores, and it is said that it has far exceeded the expectations. And most of the winning bid was by Reliance Jio, which emerged as the biggest buyer and acquired 488.35 megahertz of spectrum. Now, Mr. Uppal, can you tell us what is the significance of this auction and how successful do you think it has been?
Well, the significance is very easy to work out for the simple reason that India's telecom sector as well as broadband sector are predominantly led by wireless technologies. We do not have much in the nature of fixed line network. 99% of our traffic, I think, is wireless, and very, very few people, and those numbers are actually unfortunately going down, rely on the traditional fixed lines. So, and as you know, wireless technologies depend on access to spectrum. Without spectrum, you cannot have wireless communication. So companies need access to wireless spectrum, which is typically controlled by the government. It's a natural resource. It's a finite resource, and which is typically regulated by governments, and the government releases a certain amount of spectrum, and the current system is that operators must bid for this spectrum in an auction. The price is determined not by the government, but by through an auction. The auction starts at what is called the reserve price, and from which point people have to bid, and then whatever price is discovered by the market is really what the price is that the companies eventually pay. So the significance is that we need to cater to a large amount of data services that we have now seen growing. India is one of the world's largest markets for wireless data, and our usage of wireless data, access to internet, is expanding very, very fast. So, and this is not possible to sustain without access to sufficient spectrum. So that makes this auction very, very significant. And another reason it is very significant, and that will come out also later, is that companies have, when they get spectrum in an auction or are allocated spectrum, it is allocated for a fixed period of time, typically 20 years. So after 20 years, the spectrum can be auctioned and is auctioned again. And so the significance of this auction is also that particularly Jio had a large amount of spectrum which was expiring. Its tenure had expired, and they could not have continued their service without getting more spectrum through this auction. Auction is important, one, because wireless is critical. Second, particularly for Jio, whose spectrum was expiring in most circles, it was even more significant.
Now, most countries have started using the 5G technology, which facilitates more devices that can be connected to the network. In India, what do you see happening in terms of 5G space? And are the current auctions of the 4G indicative of what is the kind of pricing we will see? When do you see this auction happening? Can you share something on this, Mr. Uppal?
India was very, very keen to be on board the 5G train early in the game. And in fact, as early as 5-6 years ago, the government had been making very frequent comments about how India cannot afford to lose the 5G bus or 5G train. However, in practice, this is unfortunately not worked out well. We are still a bit far off from 5G services for a simple reason that the spectrum required for 5G has yet to be auctioned. And not only has it yet to be auctioned, but the reserve price, which I explained a moment ago, that is where the auction will begin when it is announced, that price is extremely high. In fact, that is 492 crores per megahertz, and typically the companies would need between 80 to 100 megahertz. So you can imagine that it is a very, very large sum that is required. Companies have argued and urged the government to reduce the reserve price and conduct the auction so that the markets could determine the value of the spectrum, or in other words, what is called a market determined price. So there has been a lot of to and fro about this, and as of now, the government has not been able to reduce the reserve price, and the companies have said that at that reserve price, they are unable to afford to bid in the 5G auction. So one, that the auction has not been announced. Second, the companies themselves are suggesting that this auction may not work for them because the price is too high. In other words, they may not bid. So that means that the chances of rollout of 5G in India recede a bit further. So let's hope some kind of an agreement can be reached between the government and the industry, and a reasonable price can be arrived at from which the auction can start, and we can have then the rollout of 5G services. 5G services can roll out otherwise relatively easily, because when it comes to the physical infrastructure, in other words, the network equipment or even the mobile handsets, that part of the ecosystem is already quite well developed internationally. There are several hundred 5G networks already in the world. So it is something that the world has really, 5G has taken off quite a bit in the rest of the world, but in India we are struggling. We hope this will be resolved soon and Indians too can access 5G services as soon as possible.
Obviously, all these challenges that you are saying they need to be tackled soon so we don't miss the bus, because technology is fast evolving and we are already lagging behind, it seems. What is the significance of this for the consumers, for the businesses, and for the overall technical infrastructure of the country?
Again, the significance is quite high, because 5G bandwidths will be close to 100 times greater than what we have today. 5G can theoretically enable a whole lot of new services which can have huge implications for various parts of the industry. There are three main things that 5G enables. One, that it gives you very high bandwidths. Second, it gives you very low latency, which means response times. So, for example, 5G technology enables a driverless car to respond faster than a car driven by a human being. So that's a huge thing, and that also makes it that much safer in many instances. And the third thing in 5G is support for what is called the Internet of Things, IoT. Because right now, you and I typically talk through mobile handsets. Those are the things that are currently on the network. But very soon you can expect almost any type of equipment, whether it is electric meters, whether it is buildings, whether it is particular factories, and a whole lot of other things, and individual devices in your home, all of them could be on the network, which will mean that the network will support literally hundreds of billions of devices. Again, 5G has the capacity to do that. So as our usage of the network becomes more sophisticated and more widespread, we will need the capacity that 5G offers. So yes, 5G is significant. It is true that right now we are still struggling to extend regular broadband to about half the country, which in fact even today relies on 2G networks and 2G handsets. So at one level, we do have that reality that half of our country people have little access, but the other half certainly has access to data services and the huge potential of internet. We would want that more and more. Indeed, we would want everybody in the country to be on the net, because the net offers a huge amount of uses to people, whether it is in their social life, whether it's in their work life, whether their businesses, and so on and so forth. So, and for example, we have often spoken about what broadband can do for education, what it can do for health, and what it can do for governance. And as you know, the government has the Digital India program, which is also very ambitious. All of this requires currently access to high quality data services. And very soon, the scale will be such that we will need the capacity of 5G as well.
Mr. Uppal, you very rightly pointed out that half of our country is still not connected to a regular broadband connection. Do you think the current 4G auctions will make a difference in the lives of consumers? What difference will they make?
This is an extremely interesting and an important question. There is no doubt that wireless broadband has expanded very, very widely in India, and yet, as you pointed out also, there are gaps. If the price of spectrum paid by the companies is excessively high, then the tendency for them is to cater to people who can pay more, people who are in bigger cities, people who are in city centers, people who have more spending power, which means that the priority for the companies is to recover the costs that they incur on spectrum, etc., etc. And obviously, these are all commercial players who want to make money. So if we make the raw material of broadband networks, in this case, spectrum, overly expensive, start auctions at a very high reserve price, even when the auctions do take place and companies do buy spectrum, we must recognize that sometimes the indirect impact of this is that the companies then are more inclined to recover their costs as early as possible, which in many instances comes at the cost of low-income customers or areas where revenues are not expected to be very high.
And if I understand correctly, that spectrum was offered across 5 airways and there were no takers for 2 of the airways. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. There was no takers for a 700 megahertz spectrum and 2500 megahertz spectrum. And the absence of takers for these 2 types of spectrum actually demonstrates 2 very different kinds of issues, both of which are of concern. In the 700 megahertz spectrum, the spectrum is extremely valuable, has very high potential, and has very high range. So when the spectrum frequency is low, that means the signal travels much farther. So, for example, in rural areas and areas where deploying physical towers is a challenge or expensive, then low frequency spectrum is very, very handy. However, the government's reserve price for that spectrum was so high that nobody wanted to touch it. So that's one. In the case of 2500 spectrum, that spectrum seems to be less exciting for most players who have deployed their 4G services in 2300, which, as you might recall, sold out almost completely, as did 800. So different parts of the spectrum hold different types of attraction for telecom players, and they have the potential of that spectrum is different based on the frequency. And the other thing is the ecosystem, because when you have spectrum, you also need to deploy equipment, you deploy phones, mobile handsets users will need to buy. That equipment and those devices that consumers use also must work on those frequencies. So we know that certain frequencies have a very good ecosystem. In other words, there is sufficient supply of network equipment, sufficient number of handsets available, so which obviously makes it a lot easier for an operator to justify its deployment. On the other hand, if you are using a frequency which is not very popular, then for you, the operator, the equipment may be too expensive. For you, the customer, the handset may be either too expensive or may just not exist. So with all that in mind, the frequencies that we auction, the price at which we auction are both extremely important.
Thank you so much, Mr. Uppal, for joining us today and sharing your views on this.
Thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on spectrum auction. The participants were Mahesh Uppal, telecom expert, and Ruchika Chitravanshi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.com. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.